the death of the planet. The death of the planet Earth, or climate change as it's called. As you know, I have long been someone with a certain, sceptical approach to the way that climate change, global warming, whatever the trendy name of the week is for weather, how it is reported, and, if you like, the intersection between geopolitics or political activism and climate change. There is no doubt the climate is changing. There is no doubt that there are variations and fluctuations in the average temperature of the planet, its crust, the oceans, and that these things have gone on for, well, millennia, literally all the time, for millennia.
4 billion years.
4 billion years, okay. Unless you're a fundamentalist Christian, then, the world's only
6,000.
6,000 years old, that's right, okay. But yes, it is changing. That's why we have weather. But what to do about it? I guess if you're a mainstream government-funded left-wing journalist, what you do is you destroy our primary industries, you plant horrible pine trees everywhere, you tell people they can't eat meat and make everyone feel guilty. But is that the only way to deal with what we'll loosely call climate change? I read an editorial, an op-ed in Stuff recently, and it pleasantly surprised me. It seemed to take a pragmatic and contextualised approach to the issue of climate change. And this was in a Stuff publication, mind you. Stuff, the people who keep on apologising for colonialism and other things. And it was such a good piece that I said to Ben, who's written this? This is really good. His name's Peter Griffin. He's a freelance science and technology writer. He was the founding director of the Science Media Centre, and he's founding editor of a thing called sciblogs.co.nz. And what Peter Griffin wrote was so interesting to me and made so much sense that I thought we should get him on the program, and he joins us now. Peter, welcome to the platform. Lovely to have you with us.
Morning, Sean.
Peter, firstly, the thing that struck me about that column you wrote and Stuff was you were not like losing your lunch and clutching your pearls. You didn't seem in a panic about the end of life as we know it.
Well, yeah, look, the column really was about some of these ancient civilizations who basically collapsed as a result of localized climate events. And while the Egyptian empire, the Mayan empire, even the Khmer empire, who left us the beautiful Angkor Wat temples, they sort of collapsed as a result of drought or extreme weather events. But in the case of the Mayans, for instance, their capital city, they abandoned it in around 1450 AD. But the Mayans continued on. What really did the Mayans in was the arrival of the Spanish, a couple of hundred years later, spreading disease and trying to subdue them. The Mayans actually survived that climate event, and instead of having one big city, Mayapan, which was their political capital, they then spread out to the regions, 15 regions across the Yucatan Peninsula, what it is now, and they basically were thriving when the Spanish arrived. So I think looking at these ancient civilizations, the message is what we can expect if the climate continues to change the way that the scientists suggest with more extreme weather events, is we're going to see a lot of migration. And that's a good thing in that humans have an inclination to get out of the way of trouble, so they will move to places where they can grow food, where they can live without constant conflict and civil war. The problem we have now is that because we've overpopulated the planet to the extent that we have, we're going to have millions of people where the Mayans in their capital had 15 to 20,000 people. 8 out of 10 of our biggest cities in the world have over 10 million people in them, and they're coastal cities. So if they see sea level rise, storm surges, drought, that's when we'll see the breakdown of society that happened thousands of years ago in some of these civilizations, and people are going to move. It's a lot harder to move these days because of political borders than it was when you could just pack up the wagon and move on hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Peter, you seem to be suggesting that adaptation is a valid and indeed successful response to climate change, or could be.
Absolutely, and we're going to have to do that. And the problem is with our focus on mitigation, which obviously we need to do. We need to accelerate that move to renewables, but we've taken our attention away from the adaptation, which, as a result of our inaction, we're going to have to do at the same time. Not only are we going to have to pay for this transition to a low-carbon economy, but we are also going to have to retreat from the shore in parts of New Zealand. We're going to have to start growing different types of crops in different parts of the world. So we now have this crunch where we have to do these two things simultaneously. And, in this country, the focus is on emissions mitigation. That's the Climate Commission's job, has laid out the pathway for doing that. Then they will look at adaptation. But already we're seeing homeowners sort of saying, what the hell's going to happen to me? Am I going to be able to get insurance on my house in the next 10 years? Is the value of my house going to decline because I'm not behind a seawall? So all of these questions are suddenly coming up, and we don't really have a plan for how this is going to be handled. What's going to happen to
No, we do have a plan. It's called functional democracy in a market economy. And that is that money and everything will move and change people's behaviours. And the market...
It's painful, though.
Well, it's going to be painful anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely... Well, I think that the more, the more we hear from the scientists, and there's just been a flurry of papers over the last couple of years on these extreme weather events, attributing at least part of some of these events to climate change. So the suggestion is we're going to see more extreme weather events. So, for instance, what we just saw in the UK, if the scientists are right...
But that was Todd. Look, I spoke to our correspondent, Neil Oliver. He said all they did was they created this new Code Red thing. I think 12 people died, not unusual. Neil Oliver remembered 1976, the last heat wave, and he says the only thing memorable about that was it was the best summer of his young life. I mean, we are very good as a media and a body politic of talking ourselves into all sorts of panic. When you look realistically at an issue, what happened in Britain, it got quite hot. Stand under a tree, drink some water.
You got to be realistic. And the reality in our country is we're going to be more insulated from the worst of climate change due to our geographic conditions. We're sort of insulated to some extent by the ocean. Where it will probably hit us the most is, we're going to be asked to take more refugees, more migrants, and that will be a political decision we have to make. We will have to move some of our crops around and deal with wildfires, but nothing compared to what Australia, for instance, is putting up with, both in terms of bushfires, but in the other extreme, as we just saw in Sydney, more extreme rain events as well. So we're going to be lucky, relatively, but there will still be people who will have to retreat from the coast.
But
so that's
Peter, the other thing is people, and I saw a figure somewhere, the number of people who die from natural disasters drops year on year on year as a proportion of the population.
Yeah,
more people
right.
aren't dying because of extreme weather and because of natural disasters. Fewer people are dying. And the actual lived experience of climate change doesn't match all the dire, the sky is falling predictions.
Well, not to date. I mean, I guess what the scientists are saying is that looking forward, as we hit, say if we hit 2 degrees of warming, we've had maybe 1 to 1.2. At 2 to 2.5, that's when you start to see major crops failing. I mean, we've already seen that across parts of Africa over the last 20 years. It's been very dry there. So look at the instability that
I'd say it's been very dry in parts of Africa for a lot longer than 2 years, Peter.
No, 20 years, really, since the 80s. Yeah, there's been Eritrea and Ethiopia.
But Peter, once again, I come back to worldwide, year on year, fewer people are dying of starvation, of dehydration. Infant mortality is dropping, right? Average education of women and everything, age of people having children. Every statistic in the world that measures how well the human race is doing is getting better every year, not worse. Despite the computer models that say that the Pacific is sinking under the oceans. I look again at real data in the Pacific, and it suggests to me that rising sea levels aren't posing such a great threat. The Maldives are still there, right?
Not at the moment, definitely. I mean, they've got bigger problems at the moment than climate change, but again, as the IPCC and others suggest, that's going to turn around this century to become their the biggest issue. But ultimately,
Yeah, but it's always... Look, I can remember going to the Maldives in 1991, right, 33 years ago with Prime Minister Jim Bolger, and going up with Don McKinnon, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, through the Pacific. Oh, climate change, climate change, climate change. 30 years on, nothing.
Yeah, and they're very low-lying, so they're right at
and it just ain't happening.
Well, it's happening, but it's happening in very small increments so far. So it's very hard to look at it and go, oh my God, should be our number one priority. But if you actually listen to what the scientists are saying, they're saying by the middle of the century... Yes, but we do
listen to what the scientists are saying, Peter, and their computer modelling and their theorising is not borne out in real-world experience.
Well, they would differ with you on that, but the reality is, I mean, put the mitigation aside, we need to adapt.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Either way. And so what do we do about that? And that's really got to be an election issue over the next couple of elections. How are we going to pay for it? How do we manage that in an equitable way? Or do we just sort of say to people, well, it's your choice to live by the coast? So
yeah, well, we do, because we just heard on the program this morning, the most robust property market in New Zealand is the Coromandel, which is all coastal.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
And I presume that means that the actuaries at the insurance companies are still happy to insure coastal properties, and they are people who are, if you like, the most mercenary about data and being unemotional and unpolitical about it.
Well, that's right. I spoke to them about this recently for a feature I wrote in the New Zealand Listener, and they said, yeah, we're still happy to do that, but that will turn the tap off as soon as the risk is beyond our appetite. So that's when you will be uninsurable. And some people are comfortable about that. They'll band together and they'll build seawalls like they did in Granity in the South Island. So, but we need to start thinking smartly about this engineering.
Why do we need to start thinking smartly about this? It would seem to me that the market, the insurance companies, people's common sense is doing just fine.
Well, if you want, for instance, still want to drive out around Eastbourne or the southern coast of Wellington, you got to think about, do we build seawalls or do we do something?
It's always been like that in Eastbourne, and I guess that's up to the people of Eastbourne, and I guess I have faith in a body politic and a political system that doesn't need a bunch of experts telling me what I should be worried about and what I should want.
Well, expertise is very valuable, obviously. I'd rather put my faith in the experts at NIWA than sort of just than in politicians making their political decisions. They've got to be informed by expertise. So I don't have a problem with that. It's just that we haven't focused on adaptation to the extent that actually some of the experts would like us to.
And look, and I don't disagree with you. I think the craziness of setting up a bureaucracy to meet an emissions target is just so far away from a practical response to whatever's happening with the climate. It's not funny. We've created a global bureaucracy full of bureaucrats, which in itself consumes energy and does little practical good in real terms. It should all be about practical adaptation, shouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And, I talk to climate scientists a lot. And when I started the Science Media Centre in 2008, I went and talked to them and said, look, how serious is this? And they said, we've sort of known from those climate models you were talking about from at least 1990, the trends and how concerning they are, and have been talking to governments about that. And if we just done an incremental change back then towards renewables, which would have been good because, fossil fuels actually kill a lot of people through just pollution. If we'd done that over a 30 or 40-year period, we wouldn't be in this situation.
Well, Peter, we're not going to agree on everything, but what I do like about that column, you're right, and I think what a lot of people would be more engaged on this issue is what is happening in the real world and how do we mitigate those attempts. You've shown us that in history, on a smaller or regional scale, big civilizations can adapt and can pivot and can, if you like, stop the sky falling, or at least ensure their own survival if they adapt.
Yeah, they sort of came through it in various forms, but I mean, if you look at the man, these these archaeologists have looked through the skeletons there, and the interesting thing they found in 1400 to 1450, a lot of skeletons with traumatic injuries. So it got pretty desperate in that city before everyone decided to abandon it and leave. That's what we want to avoid this time around.
I hear. Peter, I thank you very much indeed for your time. That is, I'd say, scientific communicator Peter Griffin. And really, it is like a religion. Climate change is like a religion, and people who have drunk the Kool-Aid, they will just not be reasoned with, because God's got to stay in his heaven or their whole world view evaporates, collapses around them.